Our economy's stuck. We're in a bad spot of just treading water. Over the last 11 years, our gross domestic product, that's how much our economy is growing, has been 1.9%. 1.9%, that's a tiny change. Just to give you a perspective, over the last 100 years, there's not been a single decade that we've had a year without at least 3% growth in that until the last decade. Literally, our economy that is typically growing, that's more jobs are being added, people are making more money, there's more happening, we're selling more internationally. That is in America for the last 100 years. It's just slowly kind of grown and grown and grown until the last 10 years, and it's flattened out. We're stuck. Now, when I was younger, we had a record player in the house. Now, for all of you under 40, I would explain a record player to say it's kind of like a CD player, only it was larger and made of vinyl. But if I say that, then all the under 20 crowd will say, what's a CD player? But let me just say this. The big black pieces of vinyl that played music at my house that occasionally would get stuck, and the record needle would land on the same groove and play the same part of the song over and over and over again. It was my job as the youngest one in the house to go over the record and bump it and get it out of that. Our economy needs that. We need to be able to get over to our economy that is stuck in the same groove at 1.9% in this incredibly low growth rate and give it a bump. Now that bump can come in a lot of ways. Increasing international trade would be a great help. Engaging more internationally. Keeping our regulations common sense and as non-intrusive as possible so that small businesses and medium-sized businesses aren't panicked all the time about what the federal government's going to do to them with a new regulation. Just keeping them common sense and simple. How about making sure that there are fewer federal forms? And the federal forms that people have to fill out not only are simple to do, but they don't duplicate with multiple different agencies. It'd be good if people that worked in small and medium and large businesses spent more time selling products than they did filling out a form for some federal bureaucracy that's never going to read that form anyway. And the obvious way to be able to bump the record needle in our economy right now is tax reform. It's not the main thing that's going to do everything, but it's a pretty big element. And if we can get tax reform done, it actually gives our economy a little bit of a boost. Now, I have folks that will say, how does that make a difference? When you do tax reform, why does that actually increase economic activity? Well, quite frankly, people around the country and around my state in Oklahoma are struggling to be able to save money because their wages aren't growing up at the same speed that everything else is going up in price. So people need to be able to save more money and to be able to have more money to be able to spend. But it's also, we need to create more jobs. And we need to get companies going again, actually developing more jobs. If people actually can get a job, if people can make more money at that job, and if people actually have more take-home pay, they spend a little more, they save a little more, the company expands a little more, and if each place does that a little bit, it dramatically increases our economy around the country. And we know it because we feel it. Making the tax code simpler for every person in every business means that people don't have to pay as much to have their taxes done. Maybe you can do your own taxes because it'd be simple enough to do it. And it wouldn't cost so much. And accountants that work for businesses could go back to working for their business to see how they can make their business more efficient rather than spending all their time just on tax policy. I think we should follow the lead of the president on this. The president made a very clear statement. He said, let's help our companies compete. But to do that, we have to also knock down barriers that stand in the way of their success. For example, the president said, over the years, a parade of lobbyists have rigged the tax code to benefit particular companies and industries. Those with accountants or lawyers to work the system can end up paying no taxes at all. But the rest are hit with one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world. It makes no sense, and it has to change. So tonight, the president said, I'm asking Democrats and Republicans to simplify the system, get rid of the loopholes, level the playing field, and use the savings to lower the corporate tax rate for the first time in 25 years. Oh, did I fail to mention that president's President Obama that said that? President Obama, right down the hallway in 2011 in his State of the Union address, that's what he said we should do. simplify the system, lower the corporate tax rate, be able to deal with all the loopholes that are in the system. It shouldn't be a partisan issue. Everyone sees this, Republican and Democrat alike. So my focus is, how do we actually get this done? And not make it into a partisan food fight here, but to actually do what's right for the American people and help bump the economy to be able to help get us going again. In my state, whether you live in Valiant or Gotebo or Hilton or Sallisaw or Muskogee or Tulsa, Oklahoma City or Lawton, this matters. Because everyone, unfortunately, pays taxes. Everyone knows it's a necessary thing, but we want to have it as simple as possible and to have it as low as possible and want to make sure it's as fair as possible. So the framework has been presented this past week. A simple framework for how do we deal with tax policy. It talks about consolidating our rates. We've got 7 rates now. We would drop that down to 4 rates. There would be a 0% rate, a 12%, a 25%, and a 35% rate. Now, some folks have asked me about the 0% rate because for a lot of Americans, they say one simple thing. Every American is an American and every American should pay a little bit in taxes. I would agree, by the way. But every American is paying some taxes. And for those folks at the lowest end of the scale, I would propose dropping the rate to 0 for them on income taxes, but they are paying their fair share in property taxes, in gas tax, in sales tax. They're helping their local fire department, their local police department. They're paying for the roads that are federally subsidized based on their gas tax. They are paying taxes, but if they're not at a rate and an income high enough to be able to survive on that rate, then let's drop theirs to a 0% for income tax, but they'll keep some of the other taxes so they can still contribute to society and still be a part of this great nation. But then dropping those rates down to the lowest bracket being 0% for income tax, then a 12%, 25%, and 35% is a pretty standard rate. Quite frankly, this is something that was proposed in the Simpson-Bowles proposal before. That was a bipartisan proposal to be able to come out on how we can reform the system. Eliminating the alternative minimum tax. You want to talk about a complicated tax code? We have basically 2 tax codes. We have the standard tax code, then we have the alternative minimum tax. And everyone who does their taxes has to do them twice to be able to evaluate which one of the codes do they actually fit into. Now, if you use an electronic system, you lose track of it because the electronic system on your computer is doing that for you. But the AMT dramatically increases the complexity of the code. We should do away with that. If we want to be able to protect the folks that are in the lowest bracket, then let's double what is the standard deduction. Right now, the standard deduction is about $12,000. Let's double that to about $24,000. That $24,000 amount for families would mean the first $24,000 of income that you would make as a family, you would fall into that 0% bracket. So you're paying 0 income tax to the federal government until you make more than $24,000. That protects a lot of families on the lowest end of the bracket to make sure that they're not falling into this. Quite frankly, in Oklahoma, most Oklahomans just use the standard deduction. They don't itemize. Doubling the itemized deductions would mean that a lot of those specialized deductions that everyone else gets actually flattens it out and makes it fairer. The number one thing that I hear from people when they fill out their taxes is not only they filled them out, turned them in, and they say, I have no idea whether I did them right. It was so complicated, I don't know if it's right. And then the second thing, though, right behind it is, why is it when I read through the 100 pages of instructions on the 1040 form, why is it when I read through that, every deduction seems to be for someone else? So let's increase the standard deduction so everybody gets a simpler, flatter, fairer system. And let's keep the biggest of the deductions that the most Americans use, like the charitable deduction or the mortgage interest deduction. If there's any 2 deductions that most people use, it's those 2. So protect those 2 in the system. Reducing the corporate tax rate. I have folks say that only benefits the biggest businesses. I always smile and say those are actually people that employ people. And if you reduce the corporate rate, that means they're more competitive internationally. That means they're not having to move their corporate headquarters overseas. For years, we have as a nation used the carrot and stick approach on trying to keep businesses here in the United States. That is, if they go overseas, beat them with a stick and try to punish them for trying to move overseas. Why don't we use the carrot approach? Why don't we find out why they're moving overseas and fix that? Many of these companies are moving overseas because of the very high corporate tax rate here in the United States. Let's fix that. Over the decades, many of our competing nations have done that. We should fix that. That increases the number of jobs, that increases economic activity, and that keeps American jobs in America. We should deal with the child tax credit and continue to be able to protect that for families. We can deal with how we do expensing. Now, if you don't run a business, that doesn't matter much to you. But if you're the one who owns the small business, you understand how expensing works. And if you have a cost to your business this year, if you can't write it off in this year, you've got to expand that out. You know that slows you down. Here's the basics of it. If you're running a small business and you need to buy a new pickup for your business, if it takes you years to be able to depreciate that out, you're slower to do it. But if you know you can depreciate it out this year in your business, you're more likely to buy that. So what? That business buys a new truck this year. Well, that not only benefits that business in having new equipment, but it also benefits the Ford dealership down the street that actually sold them the truck. And it benefits all of the people in the area that help supply that for that vehicle. So it trickles down through the rest of the economy. There are ways to be able to accomplish all these things and to be able to be as simple as we possibly can be. There's a lot of conversation been about worldwide taxation as well. People seem to get confused on that area because most people don't live in that world. Here's the basics of it. Right now, if you're an American company and you're selling things overseas and doing business overseas, when you make a profit overseas and you try to bring that money back, you get taxed overseas at their tax rate, which you should. In that country, you're making the product and selling it there. But you get taxed again when you bring it back to the United States. We're the only country that does it that way. If we'll just simplify the system, we'll actually encourage companies to be able to stay in America and then do business all over the world rather than moving their company out of America. It's a simple way to be able to do it. And it's a way that we can do and should do. You'll hear the term called repatriation. That's really what it's about, is Americans being able to move their money from overseas accounts back to the United States and get that money moving. There was a lot of conversation about the stimulus plan back in 2009, trying to get almost $1 trillion of government money, that's money from you and I, from government money, and to be able to move that around in a stimulus package. Well, let me give you the figure. Right now, it's estimated that American companies have about $2.5 trillion of private money parked overseas that they're not going to bring back to our economy because of the high cost of the tax coming back. If we were able to change that system, $2.5 trillion of private money would move from overseas back into the United States. What effect would that have on our economy? I would stipulate it'd be a pretty dramatic effect it would have on our economy. We can fix this. We can resolve this. This shouldn't be as hard as we're making it. And it can be a bipartisan approach to be able to address some basic things. Taking care of our families, making sure we're watching out for those that are in poverty, simplifying the code, making sure deductions aren't for a few, but they're spread out across the way that we handle it. Protecting things like charitable giving and the mortgage interest deduction and things that most Americans use. This is the parameters that we're trying to be able to work through over the next couple of weeks. And hopefully in the coming months, as we work through all the details in a committee process with amendments coming to the floor and being able to fight our way through the process, we can actually get to a decision that will help us long-term as a nation. This is something that can and should be resolved. But it's one of the issues that I have to raise back to this body again. This body's had a hard time actually moving on the biggest issues that we face as a nation because of the rules of this body prohibit us from debate again. Now, the rules haven't changed over the past multiple decades, but the way that we've operated has. And the American people are ticked about it, and rightfully so, and the senators in this body are frustrated about it. And may I remind us that the rules of the Senate are set by the Senate. And so if we're frustrated with the rules, we should address them. Many of you have heard me speak about this in the past before. There are 3 basic rule changes that I think changes dramatically on us getting business done again in the Senate. The biggest one is the filibuster rule. We have 2 filibusters for every single bill that comes up. One at the beginning, you got to get 60 votes to start debate. You got to get 60 votes to stop debate. Then the bill passes with 51. That needs to change. We should take away the first 60 vote at the beginning. We should be able to get onto a bill. Regardless of whether it's Republicans or Democrats in the majority party should be able to bring up a bill and debate it without being stopped. Let's bring up any issue and actually debate it. And let's not inhibit debate in this body. Now, if we can't find agreement, keep the 60 votes at the end of it so we can keep debate going until it gets resolved. But we should be able to debate the issues. The second big issue is we've got to be able to deal with nominations in an appropriate time period. Right now, currently my Democratic colleagues are forcing the long periods of time in debate for every single nominee that comes. And I've had folks say, well, that's what Republicans did in the past. That's actually not true. This is the first time that it's happened like this. Under current structure, like in this week, we're going to move 4 nominees for the president in 1 week. 4. Current structure, it will take 11 years for President Trump to get his staff. 11 years. Let me just give you a barometer of where things have been in the past. At this same date, as of yesterday, President Trump has 153 confirmations total. At this same date, President Obama had 337 total at this same point. President Bush had 358 total at this same point. President Trump's not getting his nominees heard, and it's being slow walked through the process. We have to fix that. A simple way to be able to do it is to be able to allow only 2, 4, or 8 hours of debate, not this protracted 30 hours of debate per nominee. It's already a resolved issue. Everyone knows it. These individuals have already gone through committee. They've already been voted on committee. By the time they get to the floor, it's resolved. The 30 hours of debate time is purely delay tactics now. We should be able to resolve that with a 2, 4, or 8 hours total. And here's a radical idea. If we want to get the Senate going again, we can agree to a rule change that would allow for what's called dual tracking. We would do nominations in the morning. We would do legislation in the afternoon. Right now, we can only do one thing at a time in the Senate. One thing at a time. So while we're waiting on a nomination vote, everything waits until that's done. And it just slows down the process. Why can't we do nominations in the morning, legislation in the afternoon? There's some basic rule changes that will help that are not partisan issues, that are designed just to be able to get the Senate moving regardless of who is in the majority. We've got to resolve this long term. If we don't, the American people will continue to be frustrated, and we as senators will continue to be frustrated. And one last thing. This weekend's an anniversary that I don't like bringing up. 1 year ago this weekend, a gentleman named Dr. Andrew Brunson was detained in Turkey. He's been a pastor in Turkey for more than 20 years, and he's a United States citizen. He's faithfully served the people of Turkey for 2 decades. A year ago this weekend, he was picked up by local authorities, being detained for months and months and months without charges, just swept up and held. Things are changing rapidly in Turkey right now. Turkey's not the same NATO ally and friend of the United States that they have been. The leadership of Turkey is radically changing the nature of that very open democracy and is shutting them down to become more and more of an authoritarian government. And American citizens that do business there, that do mission work there, that have friends and family there, need to be aware that Americans are being swept up and detained without charges and held, now in this case of Dr. Brunson, for a year. I have to warn fellow Americans that Turkey is not necessarily a safe place to do business and to travel anymore. Turkey has the authority right now to be able to release Dr. Brunson. He's an American citizen and a pastor. They have the ability to be able to do that. Recently, the Appropriations Committee passed an amendment into appropriation bill giving additional authorities to our State Department to be able to take action against Turkish officials that hold American citizens like this, to be able to put specific sanctions on those individuals. And I would hope in the days ahead that our State Department would use that tool in their toolbox to be able to apply pressure to the Turkish people to be able to not impose arbitrary detention on United States citizens. We can push back on the Turks. I would hope in the days ahead that the Turkish government would turn back around towards more of an open democracy. They've been a nation in the past that was historic for their stand for religious liberty and for democracy in that region. And we'd love to see a Turkish ally still stand for religious liberty and still stand for the protection of all citizens in the days ahead. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.